Hello, this is Jim McNall, ICRAMP Loss Control Specialist. I want to talk with you today a little bit about public records. This is actually one of 3 or 4 different segments dealing with public records because they're a very broad category. Let's start off with talking about what is a public record. To find the answer, we look to the Idaho Code. The Idaho Code has a great deal about public records and the availability of those to the public. First, a public record is a writing, and when we think of the word writing, we think of words on paper. But a writing is broader than that, and actually any writing, which is described as any type of information that is about the conduct or administration of the public's business, is considered a public record. And then when we look to the definition of writing, it includes every means of recording. So basically things such as photographs, maps, even voice recordings, those sorts of things, anything electronic, written, maps, pretty much any type of information other than what we have between our ears, what we remember, is going to be a writing under the Public Records Act. So it's a very broad definition and is going to include some of the types of records that we may not even think about. Things like photos that we take with our either cameras or with our cell phones, emails, text messages, all different sorts of things, forms of communication that we may not even think of as creating a public record may become public records if they deal with our public agency's business. And so that's one of the things that we recommend. Public agencies provide guidance to employees. Around the country, we've seen numerous public employees get in serious trouble because they created public records unknowingly at work and then release those inappropriately, and that can provide some liability for the agency and also provide some real problem for those employees. So we recommend that employers, public employers and private, think about providing some guidance on what employees can and cannot do at work, and the necessity of recognizing that if you create a record about your work, that's probably a public record. And so having those policies in place is a really important thing. When we talk about public records, most of the time we're talking about records requests. Requests for public records are common, and there's good reasons why we have those. They're not always easy to deal with, and so we'll talk about some of those various issues. Firstly, each public agency is required to establish a custodian or custodians. The custodian is really the person who's in charge of the records and is the person who should receive the public records requests. Many agencies, of course, are going to have several custodians. You may have, for most cities, the city clerk is going to be a custodian. You may have a custodian in law enforcement, a custodian in fire department, custodian in the planning department. So there can be several custodians, but it's really important that they be designated and everyone knows who those custodians are. The basic premise under the Idaho statute is that public records are presumed to be available for public inspection and copying unless the specific statute authorizes them to not be. So one of the things I think we need to make clear is that anything dealing with the public's business is a public record. Much of that is available to the public, but some of it is not. And the fact that it's not, things such as personnel records, the evaluations, applications, complaints against public records are not public or are not available to the public, but they are still all public records. So everything is a public record if it deals with public business. Most of it, but not all, is available to the public. When you look at the Idaho statute, it's different than many other states and the federal statute dealing with records in that the basic right is to view or copy. And so initially the statute is designed so that citizens, media, others may come and view the public records. What we find in today's world is that most of the time that isn't what happens. Frequently what we find is that the public records requests are actually requests for copies, and the statute allows for that. when a public records request is filed, and it should always be filed with the custodian of the records, there's a fairly short response time. The initial response is 3 days. So within 3 days, a custodian needs to either say, here are the records, or the records are denied, and we'll talk about some specific requirements if the record is to be denied, or yes, you can have the records, but it's going to take me a little longer, and then you can have up to an additional 7 days for a total of 10 days to get those records. One of the complicated, and it's now a moving target, issues that deals with public records is what can you charge for them? There are now new rules, and this is something that everyone needs to pay attention to. House Bill 328, which was just adopted by the legislature, actually amends Title IX, Chapter 3, which is part of that is the public records statutes in the Idaho Code. And there's always been some restrictions on charges. Now the charges don't start unless the request is for greater than 100 pages of copies, or the records that are requested include non-public information that must be redacted. An example, and probably the most common example we see here, is where there's a request for police records, records of some incident that may include some names and addresses and phone numbers of witnesses that must be redacted. Doing that is very time consuming. So there may be a charge for the actual cost for those sorts of records where you have to have someone go through and actually read them and redact them. Or any time that the request will take more than 2 hours to fill, then you can charge for it. So less than 100 pages, less than 2 hours of records that do not need redaction, under the new statutes, you may not charge anything for those. So the first 100 pages or 2 hours are free. Beyond that, you can charge actual costs. And the statute actually gives some direction on how you would calculate those costs. So it's important to do that. Ultimately, what this means is that for every public agency that has a resolution establishing fees, you should go back and review that and update that so that it's not in conflict with the new statute that's in effect now. So this is an important thing. If you have fees, go back and redo them, because probably, in fact, virtually every agency that I've ever looked at in terms of the fees they were charging will need to be changed to comply with this new statute. The second part of dealing with public records requests beyond the fees and the process to accept those applications is what types of records are exempt from disclosure. And I'm not going to go through a lot of those today because it's a fairly lengthy list. If you look at Title IX, Chapter 3, it's 9-340, A through H, which is actually several pages of exemptions, and some of them are fairly broad, some are fairly narrow. And not that you would need to be familiar with every one of those, but the custodians of records need to be familiar with at least some of the more common exemptions that apply to the records that they have. If there are records that are requested that either none of the records can be provided, or part of the records can and part are not, then the custodian, pursuant to the statute, is required to put that denial or partial denial in writing. And also that denial in writing must include the right to appeal and the appeal period. The most important thing, though, with any denial or partial denying of a record request is that you need to make a good faith effort to comply with that. Good faith means you've consulted with your city attorney. Consulting with the entity attorney is a very important thing because it provides protection for the custodian of the records. And actually there's a fine for bad faith denial. Bad faith means you denied the record without consulting with your attorney. That doesn't mean that every time there's a public records request you have to have a letter from your attorney, because for many types of records requests you may have had the same requests over and over again, and you already have a note from your attorney saying, pursuant to the statute, this is not available to the public. But it's important to have that accessibility to an attorney for everyone who's a custodian of records. That's just kind of a quick overview. Thank you for your attention.